How much is the final of a World Cup worth? For Infantino, it has a very clear price, and it is that of the votes of Morocco to continue being president of FIFA. So simple and so dirty. The most important party in the most popular sport on the planet, turned into a currency by the man who is supposed to protect it. And Spain, which is the world champion and host of the tournament, has just discovered it in the worst possible way. What Barça and Real Madrid have decided to do together in response is something that no one in 100 years of the history of football had seen coming, and that will change everything you thought you knew about the next World Cup 2030. Barça hates Madrid. Madrid hates Barça. They have been hating each other for 100 years, and this week they have signed together the most historic document that no football fan expected to see. Like, subscribe and share this video, because when you know why they have done it and what it means for the World Cup 2030, you will understand that there are things that are above all. But to understand the magnitude of what is happening, you must first understand something that football had never experienced before, something that makes the situation in Spain in the World Cup 2030 unique in the entire history of this sport since the World Cup existed. Spain won the World Cup 2026 in New Jersey, with the goal of Ferran Torres in the 106th minute of overtime. That goal was seen live by more than 1 billion people all over the planet. That goal made millions of people go out to the streets of Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, all over Spain, to celebrate for whole nights, something that the previous generation had dreamed for decades without achieving. That goal made Spain the second team in history capable of winning 2 World Cups in less than 20 years, after the historic victory of 2010 in South Africa. And 4 years exactly after that goal, Spain is going to organize the next World Cup. That had never happened in 100 years of history of the World Cup. Not even once. Never the defending champion of the title had been at the same time the host of the next tournament. Never a team had had the opportunity to defend their crown in their own country, in front of their own fans, in the stadiums where their players play every weekend. It is something unique, unrepeatable, a gift that football gives to Spain once every 100 years, if it ever happens again. In that unique context, the final of the World Cup 2030 should be in Spain, not as a whim or as an arbitrary requirement on the part of Spain, but because the logic of football, the narrative of sport, and the most elementary common sense say that when the defending champion organizes the tournament, the most important match of that tournament should be played where the champion defends his title in his home, in front of his people, in one of his stadiums. And Spain has 2 stadiums that any football fan in the world recognizes instantly, without any need for explanation. The Santiago Bernabéu of Real Madrid, completely reformed and converted into the most modern and spectacular stadium in Europe, and the Spotify Camp Nou of FC Barcelona, equally renovated and prepared to be one of the most impressive stadiums of any sporting competition on the planet. The 2 most iconic stadiums in world football in the same country in the same World Cup, organized by the same federation that just won the tournament that World Cup intends to happen. The final should be in one of those 2 stadiums. Everyone knows it, the clubs themselves know it, the Spanish Federation knows it, and Gianni Infantino also knows it. But Infantino has a problem that for him, at this time, weighs more than any sporting or historical argument. Infantino needs votes to remain president. Infantino's mandate ends, and the presidential vote is scheduled for March 2027, in Rabat, Morocco, in the country that, according to the Times, is receiving the final of the World Cup 2030, in exchange for its political support for the president of FIFA. The coincidence is so evident that it is difficult to call it a coincidence. The FIFA Congress, where the next president is elected, is held in Morocco, and Morocco receives the final, in the Hassan II Stadium in Casablanca, with capacity for 115,000 spectators, which is still under construction. Infantino met with Moroccan leaders in Rabat and left that meeting without talking to the journalists or giving explanations, or looking at the cameras. The image of a FIFA president running away from the journalists after meeting with the country that organizes the elections and that is about to receive the final of the World Cup says absolutely everything that Infantino did not mean with words that afternoon in Rabat. The Spanish Football Federation has been analyzing the situation for days, processing what it means, understanding the implications that the president of the organization that governs the most popular sport in the world uses the final of the most important tournament of that sport as a tool of personal political survival. And, according to the sources close to the Federation's environment that this channel knows, the answer that the RFE is preparing is the most forceful that no national federation had ever given to a movement of this type. But what makes that answer truly historical is not what the Spanish Federation says, it is who signs with it. Because in the last few hours, something happened within Spanish football that no one had seen before. Something that, when it comes to light, will generate more debate, more impact, and more conversation than any sports result of the last few weeks. Something that puts in the same statement two shields that in 90 years of Spanish football history had never appeared together to defend the same cause. The shield of FC Barcelona and the shield of Real Madrid. What those two clubs have decided to do together and what it means for Infantino and for the future of football is what we tell in the next part. But there is something else that deserves to be said. The Bernabeu and the Camp Nou are not just two large stadiums. They are the two most recognizable venues of world football that any fan of the world recognizes instantly, without the need for explanation. Giving them up is a direct economic blow to the financial heart of the tournament. And that is exactly what Barça and Madrid understood when they decided to act together. Barça and Real Madrid hate each other. That is not a metaphor or a journalistic exaggeration. It is a reality that any fan of the world football knows without the need for anyone to explain it to them. They have hated each other for more than 100 years. They hate each other in offices and in the fields, in the press and in social networks, and in the conversations of the fans of each of the two clubs in each corner of the planet. The classic between Barça and Madrid is the most seen match in the history of football, not because the two clubs love each other, but exactly because they do not love each other. Because there is such a deep rivalry that transcends sport and becomes something that has to do with identities, with cultures, with ways of understanding football and life that are completely opposite. In 90 years of history of that rivalry, the two clubs had never signed a joint statement. They had never made a coordinated decision about anything that had nothing to do directly with the management of their economic interests in the League of European Clubs or in the collective television agreements. They had never put their two shields on the same document to defend the same cause with the same words. Until now. Because what Infantino is doing with the World Cup Final 2030 is something that the two clubs consider that goes beyond the sporting rivalry, that affects something more important than the points in the league or the titles in the champions, that has to do with the future of football as a sport and with the dignity of Spain as the world champion country and organizer of the most important tournament in the history of this sport. According to the sources close to the environment of both clubs that this channel knows, the conversation between the directives of Barça and Madrid began when the movement of Infantino with Morocco was leaked through the Times. When the leaders of the two clubs read the information and understood what it meant, something fit in the same way in both offices. That if the World Cup Final 2030 was played in Casablanca, in exchange for votes for Infantino, was not only an insult to Spain, it was a direct insult to the two most important stadiums of that World Cup, Bernabeu and Camp Nou, to the two venues that had invested hundreds of millions in renewing to be able to organize the most important tournament on the planet, and that we're going to see how the game that makes sense to all that investment was played on another continent for reasons that have nothing to do with football. That generated something that no one within Spanish football would have predicted a week ago. A call between the two presidents of the two most rival clubs in the world. A conversation in which, according to the sources that this channel knows, both parties came to the same conclusion almost simultaneously. That there had to be a response and that response had to be joint so that its impact was impossible to ignore. The Spanish Football Federation was aware of the conversations between the two clubs. The RFF had been preparing its own statement on Infantino's movements, and when it learned that Barça and Madrid were coordinating a joint response, it decided to support that movement in an institutional way. That the federation that won the World Cup was behind the two clubs whose stadiums were resigning from the tournament, turned the gesture into something that Infantino could not simply ignore or underestimate as an emotional reaction. The statement that the Spanish Federation will make public in the next few hours says something that, according to the sources that this channel knows, will cause a silence of several seconds in anyone who reads it with the attention it deserves. It says that Spain considers Infantino's movements regarding the World Cup final a betrayal of football. That the country champion, defender of the title, has a moral right that goes beyond the contractual agreements to organize the final of the tournament in its own territory. That using that party as a currency in a political survival operation is incompatible with the values that the World Cup represents since it existed in 1930. And then comes what no one expected to read in a statement from the Spanish Football Federation. The explicit mention of the agreement between Barça and Real Madrid, two clubs that, according to the statement, have decided to put aside their historical rivalry to defend something that both consider more important than any difference that separates them within the field. And that, in response to Infantino's movements, they have agreed jointly to renounce their stadiums being headquarters of the World Cup 2030. The Bernabeu will not host matches of the World Cup 2030 if the final is played in Casablanca. The Camp Nou neither. The two most iconic stadiums of world football, the two most recognizable venues in Spain, the two that any fan of the planet automatically associates with the best that European football can offer, will be left out of the tournament if Infantino does not step back in his Moroccan operation. The economic consequences of that movement for FIFA are difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. The matches that would be played in the Bernabeu and the Camp Nou would generate income from tickets, sponsors, and television rights that no other stadium of the 20 planned for the tournament can match. The image of those two stadiums in the posters of the World Cup 2030 has a marketing value that FIFA has been using for years to sell the tournament to the major global sponsors. Removing them from the equation is not a symbolic gesture. It is an economic blow that will directly affect the accounts of the tournament that Infantino cares so much about. And that is exactly what Barça and Madrid calculated before making the decision, that if they wanted Infantino to listen to them, they had to speak to him in the language that he understands, that of money, that of the millions that enter and leave the accounts of FIFA, that of the numbers that the sponsors look at before signing the contracts of the most important competitions in the world. There is something that deserves to be said about the symbolic weight of seeing the shields of Barça and Madrid in the same document. Because for the CUL fans who are watching this video, that image has a dimension that goes beyond political rivalry. It means that there is something that weighs more than rivalry, that there are things that football has to defend, although to do so you have to sit next to the most historical rival that one can have. The CUL fans have been defending for decades that Barça is more than a club, that it represents something that transcends football, that it has a political and cultural dimension that Real Madrid does not have in the same way. And now Barça is demonstrating that in the most concrete way possible, signing next to Madrid a document that defends something that both consider more important than any difference that separates them within the field. That is also Barça, knowing when football needs its big clubs to act together, although that implies sitting next to the rival that hurts the most to lose. The statement comes out in the next few hours, and when it comes out, the world of football will talk about this for days. Because the union of Barça and Madrid to defend Spain against Infantino is the most shocking story that Spanish football has produced in a long time. And the consequences of that union, which will force FIFA to make a decision that Infantino does not want to make, are what we tell now in the last part of this exclusive story that this channel tells you before anyone else in the world of football. When the communication of the Spanish Federation reaches the offices of FIFA in Zurich, something will happen that Infantino had not calculated at any time when he carefully designed his strategy with Morocco. That the FIFA directors themselves, who had so far held their most controversial movements in silence, will have to sit down with him and tell him something that no one within the organization had told him yet with that clarity. That he has gone too far. That the political price of what he is doing with the World Cup final is already too high for the institution he leads. And that if he does not step back, the consequences will be worse than anything he has experienced during his term. Because losing the Bernabeu and the Camp Nou of the World Cup 2030 is not just a problem of public image for the institution. It is a very specific economic problem that the FIFA directors will have to explain to Infantino with real numbers on the table. The World Cup 2030 sponsorship contracts include specific clauses on the tournament's headquarters. Some of the main global sponsors of FIFA have agreements that directly contemplate the presence of their brands in the most important stadiums of the tournament, such as the Bernabeu and the Camp Nou. If those two stadiums disappear from the list of headquarters, those millionaire contracts may be affected in such a way that the FIFA lawyers will have to analyze urgently as soon as the Spanish statement is made public. That is exactly what makes the Barça and Madrid movement much more powerful than it seems at first glance from the outside. It is not just a symbolic gesture of two clubs outraged by the situation. It is a real economic lever that directly touches the tournament accounts that Infantino needs to be a financial success to justify its management to the federations that still support it. And Infantino will understand it as soon as his economic advisors explain to him what the absence of those two stadiums means in concrete terms. Because Infantino can ignore the moral arguments about the dignity of Spain as world champion. He can ignore the historical arguments about what it means to organize a World Cup final as the country defender of the title, but he cannot ignore the numbers. And the numbers will speak very clearly as soon as this statement is published. The domino effect that this statement will generate within FIFA is something that this channel considers that Infantino had not calculated at any time when he designed his approach to Morocco. Because it will not be only the FIFA directors who pressure him to step back. It will also be the sponsors, the radio broadcasting organizations that have the rights of the tournament, the investors who have contracts linked to the headquarters of the World Cup, all those who have money put in the financial success of a tournament that without the Bernabeu and the Camp Nou is no longer the same tournament they sold them when they signed their contracts. There is something that this channel wants to say about what this story means for football beyond the politics of FIFA and the economic interests of sponsors. Because there is a dimension of what is happening that goes beyond all that and that connects with something very profound in the way that fans from all over the world understand this sport. Football has competitions, it has passionate clubs, it has players who give everything on the field, it has stadiums full of history, it has coaches, it has fans who fill those stadiums every weekend with their passion and their money, and it also has institutions that are supposed to be there to protect all that from those who want to use it. When those institutions fail in that function, clubs and federations have two options. They can stay silent and let it happen, or they can act. Although acting has a cost, although acting means giving up something, although acting means sitting next to the most historic rival you can have and signing a document that would have seemed impossible a week ago. Barça and Madrid chose to act this week, and that choice has a value that goes beyond the statement and the stadiums and the millions that FIFA is going to lose if Infantino doesn't back down. It has the value of showing that football still has people and institutions willing to defend what really matters, although the price of that defense is economically very high for both clubs. For the fans who are watching this video, there is something else in this story that deserves to be underlined. Barça signed that statement knowing what it meant, knowing that giving up Camp Nou as the home of the World Cup was giving up something huge, the games that would have been played in that renovated stadium in front of its own fans, the image of Camp Nou in the most important tournament posters in the world, everything that that World Cup could have meant for the club and its fans. And he signed it anyway, without a doubt, because there are things that Barça has always considered more important than the economic interests of the club in the short term. And defending the integrity of football against someone who uses it for their own ends is exactly one of those things. That's Barça. That's the club that the Cules have been defending for decades when they say it's more than a club. Not because a slogan says it, because it shows it when it's time to choose between what's right and what's right. There is one last thing that deserves to be said before closing this story. About Infantino, not about what he does, but about what he represents. Because Infantino is not the first president of FIFA who uses his position for his own interests. The history of the organization is full of people who confused power with property, who believed that controlling the most popular football in the world gave them the right to manage it as if it were theirs. Vlader did the same for decades and ended the way he ended. Platini also believed that power belonged to him and also ended the way he ended. FIFA has a history of presidents who at some point crossed the line between managing football and appropriating it. And Infantino is crossing that same line right now, using the final of the most important tournament on the planet as a currency to buy votes in an election that should actually be irrelevant compared to the magnitude of what he manages. Spain has seen it clearly, Barça has seen it, Madrid has seen it, and the three together have decided that this time the answer was not just going to be a complaint, but a concrete act with real and immediate economic consequences that Infantino cannot ignore because they directly affect what matters most to him at this time. Football wins when the people who love it are willing to defend what it is against those who try to turn it into something else. This week football is winning thanks to a world champion federation that is not willing to steal the final from his own World Cup, and thanks to two clubs that for 90 years have hated each other and that this week showed that when football really needs it, they are able to sign together. What Infantino will do in the next few hours, when the message reaches his hands and FIFA announces what will be the answer, is what this channel will tell as soon as it happens. Subscribe and like because this story is not over and everything that comes we tell here before anyone else.